Welcome once again to everyone who's joined us tonight. And we always begin by reminding ourselves, what was the genesis of this? And in many ways, the genesis was the person for whom we've named the program, Neil Conley. For many of us here, we know Neil to have been a brother, a Christian, a disciple who journeyed with us, a pastor for many years in the South Bronx and Lower East Side, and then gratefully and gracefully up here at St. Francis de Sales. And Neil, I like to think of truly as a prophet. And prophets are the people that the world catches up with. Not always understood or not always welcomed, although Neil was, I think, understood by many and welcomed certainly by tons of people. But I think his vision of church was something that was still waiting to be born, but we're beginning to see something of that happen during this pontificate, during the pontificate of Francis. Neil was a firm believer in the Second Vatican Council, the empowerment of the laity, words that now were beginning to become quite common in our parlance as Catholics, co-responsibility, solidarity, synodality, were all building blocks for Neil. And he felt very passionately that the laity deserved as much ongoing formation as did the clergy. So when we began to talk about our adult faith formation series, Neil was the obvious candidate for whom to name it. So we're very happy, and we kind of feel he's a bit of our patron saint, looking down and accompanying us. I know he would be smiling, hearing so much of what is spoken about. And then this year, we thought particularly of Fratelli Tutti, and this idea that the Pope has, really a dream of that. As horrible as this time of pandemic has been, it's given us an opportunity to be able to look into the treasure of the church's teaching in terms of social justice teaching and the tradition, our scripture, and our lived experience as a world that has been in some ways all aggrieved of this. But also, it's a time for us to dream and to begin to take from our treasure of scripture, our spirituality, and begin to put that together to help create a new world. And one of the things that attracted us when we were reading it together as a staff, and we were very conscious of Dr. Clark's work, was the concept of solidarity. How do we ford bridges? How do we overcome the divide, political, cultural, all sorts of divides that exist in our country and our world at the present time? And we have another prophet amongst us, Francis, who has been brave enough to be able to start a conversation and to be able to speak about hope in the middle of so much despair. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Clark, Meghan Clark, with us this evening from St. John's, and Jane will give you more of her bio. And we begin thanking God for the opportunity to come together this evening. And we put ourselves in prayer for a moment. Almighty God, you gather us in as a community. You help us to know who you are through discovering the stranger who becomes the friend to us. As we discover in the middle of tragedy and sorrow the presence of Jesus, the cross, but also the promise of resurrection. In this Lenten season, allow us to journey together, to discern together, and as Francis, our Pope, has asked us, to dream together. Allow this evening to be fruitful for us as we enter individually and communally more deeply into this important document, and we dream together and we create together a better future. And we ask this as we ask all things through Christ our Lord.
Amen. Amen.
Jane, please.
I am pleased to introduce to you, though, especially those of you who haven't met her last time, Dr. Meghan Clark. She's an associate professor of moral theology at St. John's University, where she also serves as a senior fellow of the Vincentian Center for Church and Society. In 2015, Dr. Clark was a Fulbright Scholar to the Hekima Institute for Peace Studies and International Relations in Nairobi, Kenya. In May 2018, she was a visiting residential research fellow at the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of Durham in the United Kingdom. Additionally, She is on the Faculty Advisory Board for Catholic Relief Services, CRS University, Faculty Learning Commons. From 2010 to 2013, she served as a consultant to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Domestic Justice. From 2012 to 2018, she was on the board of directors of America Media. She is the author of The Vision of Catholic Social Thought, The Virtue of Solidarity, and the Praxis of Human Rights, and her articles have been featured in publications such as U.S. Catholic, America Magazine, and the Millennial Journey. We are proud and pleased to have her with us tonight. So, Meghan, let's begin.
The theme last time was focusing on the parable of the Good Samaritan and the way in which Pope Francis invites us to think about ways of becoming and being neighbor to those around us and those we may never meet in different ways as the theology, as the gospel core of what he's doing in Fratelli, Tutti. And as Father Phil noted, right, the whole thing is an invitation to dream, and he asks us to let us all dream together of a different world. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is Fratelli, Tutti, and Catholic social teaching, specifically on the idea of good politics and what that means for the common good and solidarity, and kind of set up a deeper conversation about dialogue and friendship and struggle among all people of goodwill for the conversation that fellow parishioner and Fordham professor Leo Guardado and I will have in our third session. We are in a moment of not just pandemic, but of profound division and distrust. January 6th, a particularly shocking eruption, but I can think back years ago to the debates about the Affordable Care Act and town halls that would be broadcast on the news, in which people would say things like, "Keep the government out of my Medicare." This setup in which the government and politics is something other, something distrustful, something we need to be protected from, of elected officials who are asking us to vote for them, and yet standing up there bragging that they are not politicians, as they are seeking oftentimes re-election for political office. This problem isn't just an American one, although certain aspects of it certainly feel that way. The way in which, and we can talk about this more later, the way in which responses to wearing masks and social distancing rules during the pandemic has been one place where what is coming out is a very different sense of the political community and where individuals and community fit together than we find in Catholic social teaching for one. It isn't just an American problem, though. I spent time teaching in Nairobi, as was mentioned, and almost every week, discussions would come up where students would bring up the issue of corruption. And these were students from across different countries throughout Eastern and Central Africa, as we were talking about religion and peace building. And what was the biggest barrier to democracy? And questions of political corruption are real. I spent some time this morning on a Zoom call with a colleague in Manila who ministers to women and wives and mothers who are themselves victims and survivors of their family members who have been killed in the extrajudicial killings of the Duterte regime, which have not abated pretty much at all during this pandemic, in which he was describing the way in the Philippines the pandemic has been militarized in the way the response has been implemented. It hasn't been a public health response. It's been a militarized police response. So nationally and globally, it is easy to see on the one hand, why it's hard, for example, for me to convince students that we should be engaged and positive about politics. But also there is a widespread kind of emotional problem that takes different forms in different countries, but at its most worrying has been to a resurgence of not just violent populism, but also emerging and burgeoning fascism as well, and a nationalism that makes living out the parable of the Good Samaritan that much harder. And so I set that out as our frame for two reasons. One, because I think there's an awful lot when you read the sections on Fratelli Tutti about politics, where it's really easy to say, okay, well, Pope Francis is talking directly to us and he's talking about us. But also, and there's a way in which I actually do believe that is true. It's just he's never only talking to us. He's also, right, when he talks about these challenges, he's also talking to the people of the Philippines. He's also talking to the people of Brazil and the people of Italy pretty directly, in addition to the fact that he's always talking to everybody. But there is an acute nature to the question of what is good politics at this particular moment, I think, in the United States of America. So what is it that I think Francis is doing? I want to propose to you that I think that Fratelli Tutti is essentially Pope Francis's wake-up call to all of us. And it's a wake-up call not just about caring for our neighbor, but specifically about what kind of social and political community we are part of and we are building. I want you to kind of think about this idea of Fratelli Tutti as a wake-up call. And then the question is, as we move forward, what is he calling us to? And are we going to get up, or are we just going to hit the snooze button? What I want to emphasize is that this understanding of the very nature of politics itself is that this is not some Hobbesian negative view of the government. It is not a view of the government as existing to restrain wickedness or sin. It isn't even a dichotomy between the city of man and the city of God that you get in Augustine and others, where again, the mortal politics is something that is set up to contain evil sufficiently that Christians can live out their Christian vocation. And therefore, they tolerated and saw the Roman Empire as an instrument of God's will, whereby we were then given the freedom to exist separately, but in this sense of negative peace. Catholic social teaching, particularly in the last 40 years, differs greatly from this. It also differs greatly from something that hits a little bit closer to home that we don't often think of as being in contrast. It differs greatly from the vision of Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker. For Dorothy Day, the government is something to view with suspicion. She would not, members of the Catholic worker, many of them will not vote. Dorothy Day would not pay taxes. The view of government was of something to be viewed with suspicion because it wielded power. Catholic social teaching, and as part of it, Fratelli Tutti, offers a very different vision of the polis, of politics, of the state, of government, not necessarily in any particular instance of it, right? Not of the US government per se, but of government itself as a mechanism by which we live and we participate. It is a positive view of the state and of democracy that calls for all to participate. It is in the service of the common good and justice that we come together as polis. And this is pushing back to people like Thomas Aquinas and the sense, it's also what roots our sense of just and unjust laws. Because government has a positive function, because it serves as a way, civil law and civil society in this way serves as a way that we come together as a community. It both, right, is why we call for our laws to be just, but the mechanism by which we say, no, we're going to stand up and demand differently when those laws are unjust. Things like civil disobedience and the civil rights movement, challenging segregation is an example of this. Politics, government, interdependence as a reality are all part of human life that Catholic social teaching does not view as a negative thing by itself. So the fact that we need each other isn't a bad thing. It's part of how we're human. It's part of how we image God in the world. It's part of how we flourish. So as such, coming together as a democracy, practicing that in service of the common good becomes a tool by which we can build a more just community where we have solidarity. Government, any individual government, and any individual democracy itself are still going to be flawed and finite because they're made up of human beings, and we are flawed and finite. But they don't exist in Catholic social teaching as a capitulation to sin, which is how a lot of other kind of systems set up. If we don't have government, nobody will protect us. If we don't have government, there'll be complete chaos. Here it's, if we don't come together in the polis, we don't flourish as much. We don't have the creativity and the invention and the beauty and the community. We don't have solidarity unless we come together. And it's because of this that, because of having this sense, it also allows Catholic social teaching, as I'll mention in a little bit, to have government in its place and to have the role for religious communities and the role for families, that all different aspects of human society have their place, in part because they're all seen as part of what does it mean for us to live fully human lives together. The political theology that is found in Catholic social teaching is fundamentally hopeful, which you may or may not think is realistic or justified, or at any given moment in the last year be feeling particularly connected to yourself. It can be really difficult these days to latch on to hope as we hit a year in some form of pandemic, isolation, and quarantine. And yet those signs are there. And that hope is really central to the vision that Francis is laying out in Fratelli Tutti for that and a number of reasons. In all of this, democracy, participation, the polis, it's tied to an idea of something that it as both process and virtue for Catholic social teaching. So it is a good thing for people to want to go into public service, right? A good politician is something that is a virtuous contribution to the common good for Catholic social teaching. But the process matters a great deal for all of this. And voting rights are a major discussion point these days. Right? That question of process, of democracy as process, of politics as process, is going to be a way in which we think about in Catholic social teaching who is and isn't at the table. right? So that inclusion of every single person that is part of the community, and that everyone has a right to be part of the common good, that it isn't the common good if anyone is left out. That's where fundamentally what we're talking about isn't utilitarian. It isn't the greatest good for the greatest number. Nobody can be sacrificed as an acceptable loss, as inconsequential for Fratelli Tutti's vision of good politics, which is part of why I said, right, it's process, because there's nothing we can point to that is, and here's when this was lived out, and here's when it was gotten right. All right, there are things that are gotten right along the way. There are moments of light and moments of hope. And it very much endorses the same political theology vision that you see in Dr. King when he says the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Right? For both Fratelli Tutti and King, that bends towards justice is because of the faith in God, because of the sense that in the end, God's justice does win because God is just. But this sense of process, right, that we're all called to do our part, but at the same time, we're never going to get it all right, right? We're not the Messiah. We're not the ones who will save the country. We're not the ones who will save, insert whatever issue or community. Together we can work to bring about more justice than there was yesterday. But once you have that vision wherein the end is God's action and not ours, it frees you, for Catholic social teaching, it frees you to focus more on the process and on making sure we are not in a naive liberalism sense of progress, like we're always moving this way, but in a realistic sense of we can more fully image God today together than was happening before. And so that sense of inclusion is really important. I gave a talk once at the Catholic Worker House, at Mary House. I have had the privilege to get to know a little bit Martha Hennessy, Dorothy Day's granddaughter, who's active in the peace movement and is currently serving a sentence for civil disobedience at a nuclear weapons site. And I'm going to talk about faithful citizenship and Catholic social teaching on politics to a room full of people who don't believe in voting and don't believe in paying taxes. And there was a funny moment where one of the Catholic worker activists and I had this kind of moment of understanding where she said she wanted to get rid of the table, but as long as that table is there, she's going to stand there and fight with you to make sure you have a seat at it. And I said, Catholic social teaching thinks we need the table and we need to make it bigger. And we need to put up, we need everybody at the table, but we do in fact need the table. And so that sense of how do we build a bigger and a more inclusive table? Okay, I have to go. Part of how we do that is through solidarity. And I'm titled it this way because that's the way that it's titled in Fratelli Tutti, and the social role of property. Solidarity is much more than just, as Francis notes, it means more than engaging in sporadic acts of generosity. John Paul II defined it as a firm and persevering commitment to the common good of all. But in practice, particularly in a capitalist society, it is virtually impossible to envision without what we call the universal destination of created goods as a very close companion. Why do I say that? So for those who don't know, Catholic theology, right? This isn't just Catholic social teaching. This goes back to the Acts of the Apostles and the Church Fathers. And this has been one of the most consistent things that people who are concerned about doing social ethics in the Christian tradition have come back to over and over again. And in Fratelli Tutti, Francis references John Chrysostom in particular, who's one of the he was called the Golden Tongue for his preaching on poverty and the universal destination of goods. He would go as far as to say that if you had 2 coats and someone else had none, you had in fact stolen your extra coat from the poor. He pulled no punches. He's a favorite of my father's, who's an economist. The universal destination of goods emphasizes that our starting point when we talk about distribution of anything, when we look at how the world is divided up and how land and money and wealth and all of that is structured, that the goods of creation are meant for all, period. And so the primary principle, the primary right in Catholic social teaching and Christian theology is that the earth is created, the goods of creation are meant for all. Underneath that, secondarily, derived, not as important, right? Dependent on it, is the principle of private property. Private property is a derived right from the universal destination that says, but in the interest of the common good, it serves us all that sometimes things are divvied up where individual people or groups of people control and care for certain resources. And right, going back to early church, right, we're talking actual land. As I say with my students, but I think this applies in all areas of life, if it's nobody's job to clean the kitchen or the bathroom, they get one of 2 things happens when you live in community. Nobody cleans it and it gets really, really gross, or always the same person cleans it. And then they just get more and more and more and more resentful. It is for the common good that when you live in community, chores are specified and delineated, and everybody knows what it is they're supposed to do. It is for the common good that some people are politicians, and some people are lawyers, and some people are nurses, and some people are teachers. Differentiation helps us have and do more things. We don't often think about that as being part of what we're talking about when we talk about a right to property. But that's essentially what's going on when we talk about a right to private property. It's saying the good of everyone, including the flourishing of creation itself, will benefit if if I'm responsible for my lawn and my land and using my resources within the common good. It's a way of everybody playing a part. But when it doesn't function that way, it can't be justified. So claims of, but that's my property, while huge swaths of the population do not have enough to eat, do not have land to have safe housing, Catholic theology does not say, yes, but that's your property. It says, well, no, the goods of creation are meant for all. So the way we're distributing them is not in the interest of the common good, and therefore needs to be re-examined. That's what Francis is getting at in the tweet that you see in front of you. an awareness that we are either saved together or no one is saved. Poverty, decadence, and suffering are in one part of the earth, our breeding ground for problems that will end up affecting the whole planet. This is why Francis says things like inequality kills. The sense where some people we're not even talking just anymore about exploitation, but as if they're not even there. Exclusion, where they're no longer a part of the society in which they live. They're simply thrown away, when he uses the phrase the throwaway culture. He's talking, right, the antidote is solidarity, but we don't get to that unless we also rethink our understanding to the systems within which we distribute goods and resources and power within our local, national, and global communities. How do those things get decided? It's not just economics out here, it's politics. How we collectively distribute resources, who has access to vaccines, on what timetable, and in what order and at what cost, both here and abroad, is a matter of politics as much as it is a matter, more so even than it is a matter of economics or science. Good politics would look at what is it and how is it that we build solidarity, and how is it that we have a just distribution of our collective both wisdom and resources so that everybody can flourish. So in practice, this means that we reject, and he goes through these in, I marked it so I could tell you what passage it was. In 177, as he's identifying the politics we need. It's we need to reject politics without ethics, reject economics without politics, and reject visions of politics without global structures. So what do those three things mean? Politics without ethics, I mean, we see that a lot. And we see that in many different scenarios. We see that in corruption. We see that in harassment. We see that in various forms of abuse and scapegoating. Economics without politics, the most extreme example of which was Ayn Rand did an interview in which she said she was for the complete separation of government and the market, the complete separation of economics from government. And so the less and less that, the more independent people perceive economics to be, the more it gets set up as if it's this thing out here, as opposed to something that is fundamentally a set of human structures that humans influence, and therefore either is something that is made to be at the service of the common good or the service of the few who control more resources. One of the places that debate is happening right now is on the debates about vaccines and patents, which is very interesting in terms of whether or not companies and countries and other parts of the world who have the capability to make the vaccine, will the formula be made available to them, or will it be considered proprietary knowledge so that only the companies that developed it can control the money that one would get from the vaccines to COVID-19. And politics without global structures. It is far from perfect, but things like the United Nations and regional transnational organizations are, for Catholic social teaching, an important part. they're also, for better or worse, a place where Catholic social teaching has always envisioned things with rose-colored glasses, much more so than what exists in practice. So from 1963 onward, basically, every Catholic social teaching, pope, and encyclical has endorsed global governance, has endorsed some greater sense of the need for global regulations on the global markets, on the environment, on human rights. And they all kind of envision a global community and the United Nations that will be developed to be able to enforce those things. It's never existed. And there's not a whole lot of movement among the nations to make it happen. And so, as I said, it's about process and a vision of the end. It's not necessarily that we have gotten there. Right? So the alternative is good politics, which combines love with hope and with a confidence that people are fundamentally good. It embraces tenderness, which is something Francis likes to talk about a lot. And it recognizes that everybody can contribute and participate. And so it practices subsidiarity on every level of political and civil society. And in Fratelli, Tutti, a little bit, in his COVID messages on subsidiarity even more, Pope Francis talks about subsidiarity with the virtue of hope and as a sense of our shared responsibility. So we often hear subsidiarity, which is kind of a weird Catholic social teaching thing, as the government shouldn't subsume the family and the local community and the parish, that religious communities should be allowed to do what it is that they do, and the family should make decisions about the education of their children. But it's not really, that's not really what the principle is. The principle is a way of us thinking about that the common good means all of the different political communities and civil communities that we're part of, that we need all of them. We need our religious communities. We need our local villages. We need all of these different levels to collaborate such that at its best, the larger groups like the federal government, right, if subsidiarity was working well, right, then vaccines would be allocated and individual state plans would work because individual states know where their population is and what their infrastructure is to get the vaccine out. When it doesn't work, we see what we're seeing in a whole lot of places, right? When it doesn't work, we end up with where things aren't working together. And that's when an example would be in terms of segregation and the civil rights movement. It was upholding subsidiarity to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s, because individual states showed that they were unwilling or unable to protect and uphold the civil rights of all of their citizens. And therefore, we needed national legislation. And there's lots of examples of how these things work. But if these things came together, if we had hope and practiced solidarity and subsidiarity and tenderness, Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti thinks that we can have a better kind of politics. The question is, what do you think? Do you think that's possible? Or do you think, as many critics of Catholic social teaching would echo, that this is just way too optimistic about who we can be?
I guess I believe that it's possible. My whole life, or my whole life has measured to that. So it's obviously it's a sense of deep hope, but it also at the same time has given me joy, a lot of pain, or a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, but it also has given me joy. So if we're taking a quick vote on this, I'm going to vote that we're moving forward. We are in a process that has gone before us and will follow us.
I agree totally that it's a process. It's like you're building a house, and you start somewhere and you develop it more, and then you live in the house for 3 years, and then you develop something else. I think that our consciousness changes, our awareness, that what we see as needs. And I think you've just got to respond to them. I mean, that's the call that we have. That's all we have.
Megan?
Yeah.
I have a question. As you speak about the polis and, how Catholic social teaching really offers a real good entry into how it's made up of several components, not just one, and we always say this, even when we speak about the kingdom of God, it's not the church. The church is part of it, but it's not the church. Right now, one of the, I think, major attacks in this country is on voter enfranchisement and trying to disenfranchise people. You brought up the Civil Rights Voting Acts. Now, maybe I'm not hearing it, it's very possible, but have there been public policy statements from the USSCB in terms of really coming out strongly as a matter of justice and the common good about our need to really stand with people who have been disenfranchised and continue to be disenfranchised of their vote, and how antithetical this is toward real democracy and toward a real healthy society?
Have there been, are there statements? Yes. Are they strong enough and followed up with real commitment? No. Where we do see it is in network. And so, right, I would say that where you see that really coming out is the Nuns on the Bus. They're emphasizing and they're fighting for, but at its most basic, if we don't have the right to vote, then all of our democratic rights start to fall apart. Because that is the most it's not the best or the fullest way we participate, but it is the necessary entry point, because that's how we select who it is that is going to make our laws. And so, right, like that's the bare minimum for any sort of democratic republic is voting. And if it didn't matter, and I mean, John Lewis made this point frequently, if it didn't matter, there wouldn't be such strong desire to try and stop people from voting. I mean, what's happening in Georgia right now should be something we're hearing. And maybe the Georgia bishops have said something. I have not seen anything. But to be perfectly honest, my social media and my TV news watching for the last 48 hours has been largely dominated by Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. So in a way that, right, like other elements of the common good should have been part more of what was the vote in Georgia by their state assembly or state senate to take away the right to vote by mail should have been higher up on the news than Meghan Markle and Prince Harry.
What are the most effective interventions with the bishops you've seen?
I don't know. People write statements, they don't they don't work. On a basic level, the institution doesn't care that a group of theologians has said X. They might care if an entire diocese of priests said something, but even that I'm not sure. I think ways to I think much more effective is trying to mobilize action within parishes, because individual communities, if you can get your priest and your parish on your side, that we need a voter drive and we need to have somebody come and talk about immigration law, right? Like an immigration lawyer come, because there are people who don't know what their rights are and they don't know who to go to for help. Or there's a community that, can vote, but they're not registered when people look, right? Like, I think those are things at a local level. And then looking for, there are plenty of, like the Nuns on the Bus, like the Poor People's Campaign with Reverend William Barber or Bishop Barber. There are collective Christian action that is quite effective at mobilizing things like voter registration and finding ways to support the activities, which for us in New York is often money, to communities in places like Georgia where they are trying to get, have demonstrations, because especially in COVID, we can't physically go places safely. But that's letter writing and statements of support and financial support, right? When you have this bigger sense of politics and this bigger sense of the universal destination and the common good, then it's not just some generous activity or charity. It's actually, that's how we understand it, as being part of how we together work for justice. And for some people, it's not that that's not a contribution to justice. It's how we, support each other across divides of distance and resources. But so I would say, this is an area where, things in one's local community and groups like Network are where I'd go to see what actual activities are happening, because I do think the next 2 years are going to be one very big, long fight about voting rights. And so I would actually say to start is, are you, again, in New York, this is less of an issue because neither of our senators are opposed, but ways of supporting and talking to people in other states to get HR 1, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, through Congress and signed into law. I think that's probably legislatively the most important thing of the next 2 years. Because when we have the next national election, without that, we're going to see massive voter infringement as a backlash for voter turnout among communities of color in this past election. And so that would be the kind of the place that I would start, friends and family who live in states like Pennsylvania to get HR 1 voted on. It's been voted on by the House, but we've got to get it voted on in the Senate.
How is it that you think, Dr. Clark, that the Christian right, why is it the Christian right, and specifically evangelicals, seem to be so much more effective at like organizing and unifying their coalition, seemingly, than Christians on the left?
A couple of reasons. One is money. they have a much more concentrated set of financial backers that pour money into it, because the flip side of is it's all right. I said, right, no economics without politics, and government without politics without ethics. Follow the money, and you'll find very, very wealthy people where it isn't really about whatever it is the evangelical Christian right is saying they care about, but it's the economic policies that also are behind said political candidates and said parties and all of that. And so that's part of it, is there are wealthy people on the left. There are super rich people on the left.
Yeah.
But they're not single-minded in the way in which the, say, Koch brothers were. They don't, or in the Catholic world, Tim Bush and company are at the Napa Institute. There isn't the targeted, so they give money to a lot more different things. But there's also a sense of, if you believe in grassroots voices of the people, you're always going to be more diverse in your message than if from the top down, you have a single message that everybody's just got to get on board with. And so you're kind of, right, you're navigating against that in terms of the very understanding of community and politics among the Christian left, because of the way it sees, well, we have to listen to people and we need, but part of it is that the political left has not ran away from using the language of faith and ceded it to the political right. And that's where we're at a moment where the most outwardly, personally religious president of my lifetime might help change that a little bit. I mean, why don't we own the fact that before him, right, the most public president who talks about his faith really was Jimmy Carter, right? He writes books as post-president about his Christian faith. People think faith and presidents on the left, and we think of Kennedy because he was the first Catholic, but he wasn't a particularly religious Catholic. If the political progressives in this country embraced more, witness of people like Jimmy Carter, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are talking about faith more. Cory Booker, like people, particularly on things like criminal justice, are owning the religious language more. And I think that will shift things. But it's always going to be harder to mobilize when we have, 10 issues that are all really, really important and not one issue that is all we're going to talk about. And so that's an area where I wish we were more organized, but I don't really want to be single-minded the way they are. If we also had more, I wrote a piece that's going to be up on the Georgetown Berkeley Center's, the Berkeley Forum this week has a forum coming out at the end of the week on US Biden and Catholicism. And I wrote about workers' rights and the church on work and unions. It's also a place where some of the ways in which we used to organize together for the last 40 years have been eroded in our public spaces. And so one kind of real powerhouse place where this more integrated vision of the common good as being political and economic and people coming together across divisions had been what was organized labor and Christians, and in particular the Catholic Church, but other Christian progressives as well. And there was a very strong connection that for a number of reasons pulled apart, along with the fact that, from 1980 onward, we've seen a constant barrage of anti-labor laws and a decline in union membership across the country. It's not that any particular union, again, it's not like there's ever, here's the perfect one, and we just need to be like this. But that was a way in which people collectively came together in order to work for a better distribution of things and the dignity of work that the Catholics in this country were a really big part of.
Yeah.
Maybe they can be again.
One quick question. In terms of the church, this community that we belong to, you mentioned the labor movement. Where is the 21st century Cesar Chavez, the Dorothy Days?
Mhm.
Have we been co-opted by a false sense of Americanism, in the sense that, you speak about, it's absolutely positively church teaching, the universal destination of goods. I think that makes Americans very nervous, because they see it as creeping socialism, and Big Brother's going to take over, and as opposed to so many of us were not from the manor born. We depended upon unions, and we depended upon the common good to be able to lift us out of poverty, and in many cases indentured servitude. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that there were towns in Pennsylvania where people were owned by the company.
Fine.
When did this shift come? Because we have to prove ourselves to be good red-blooded Americans who believe in, everybody pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and anything contrary to that is, socialism. And why is it such a secret that we teach the universal destination of goods?
I had multiple reporters that I had to talk to when Fratelli Tutti came out, and I was like, look, I'm sorry, dude, but this isn't new. This is the oldest thing in here. Yeah, there's some things on war that are a shift in a direction, but that stuff that you're saying about the universal destination in economics, that's not new. It's in everything.
And John Paul II,
John Paul has it there
who was very strong. He,
on the social mortgage
as
of
much as he was
property.
against communism, he was not a number one proponent of unchained,
No.
capitalism.
And Benedict XVI even stronger in terms of on the need to write after the financial crisis of 2008. Caritas in Veritate suffers from the fact that it is really not a readable text for that, the average person. And so as a result, doesn't get really looked at very much on these things. And it's quickly Francis becomes Pope, and he can communicate in written and speech in a beautifully prophetic and accessible way. So the shift happens in the United States context, right? It's two things. It's one, as American Catholics get wealthier. And let me rephrase that, as white American Catholics get wealthier. Because we were not the first American Catholics in the United States of America. And we shortly will not be the majority of them anymore again. But it's as white Americans, as the Irish and the Italian and the Polish got wealthier, they shifted. And that went along with, with a shift in a vision of authority under John Paul II, where we got less and less ecclesial leadership that would speak prophetically on these issues. Because what got you made a bishop was towing the line on particular interpretations of sexual ethics and gender divisions, was believing in complementarity and having a legalistic approach to some other things. And there are exceptions, obviously, but for the most part, that's also along the time when the canon law degrees became a sign that you were on the bishop track. And lawyer, right? Like the universal destination of goods isn't going to come out of the mouth of someone whose training is in law, right? Like we now have a majority of, I would say, priests and church leaders who either don't know economic justice for all or intentionally, right, like pretend it doesn't exist. But in 1986, that was the voice of the church, and there were congressional hearings on it. My dissertation advisor, David Hollenbach, and Father Brian Hare testified about economic justice for all to Congress. Such was, right, the discussion about economic justice and inequality, and distribution of wages and goods and the poor. It's hard to envision that now. So I think it's as actual Catholics got wealthier. I have heard, but I'm not old enough to remember this to know if it were true. But I'm told that the response, not to economic justice for all, but the attempt to write a pastoral statement on women, led to a crackdown and change in how socially engaged the U.S. church was desired to be from Rome. It doesn't surprise me that it apparently had to do with women. Because it's 79, there's the statement on racism, 83 on peace, 86 on the economy. And then it's the early 90s that there was, I guess, and I don't know if something did come out, but the disagreement and unhappiness about what some people wanted to propose in a statement on women. But this is all other people telling, this is all hearsay. I was not aware of such things happening at that point. So I don't have personal memory, historical memory of these things. But I'd say, where's the Cesar Chavez of today? That's a good question. In my experience, though, it is interesting that the last time I checked, the head of the AFL-CIO, like the head of a lot of these labor movements, are still Catholic. A lot of the leadership of SEIU, the head of the AFL-CIO, they tend to be Catholic. The bigger issue for me isn't the church through the bishops, but our Catholic institutions. Catholic universities across the country are union busting. St. Leo in Florida just decertified their union. Marquette, Boston College, a number of them actively trying to stop service workers and adjuncts at their institutions from unionizing. Marquette's website about how like the union will get between us and you is so disingenuous, even as they're saying, but if you vote for it, obviously the law says we'll abide by that, but you'll be giving up direct access to us. I mean, it's, and this is a Jesuit university. So it's much deeper than, much deeper, I think, than even just ecclesial leadership. I think there's a real sense that the white American church doesn't seem to see work, the dignity of work and economic justice as part of central to its identity. And it might sound like Marxism, or socialism, but if you take a look at Acts chapter 2 sometime, all things were held in common.
Hard to argue with that.
So.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight, for your questions and your interest and your conversation. We want to remind you that our third and final session with Megan is on Tuesday, March 23rd at 7 p.m. And we'll be talking about people of goodwill. And Megan will be joined by our colleague and our parishioner, Dr. Leo Guardado from Fordham University.